Well, there's not a lot of people left in China to listen. Chairman Xi has now instituted a cult of personality that is far tighter than anything we have anywhere else in the world, and is tighter than any cult of personality in Chinese history, including Mao. There is now a buffer between him and any information. He doesn't even have advisors that give him constant updates anymore because he's literally shot the messenger so many times that nobody wants to provide him with information. Not information that might upset him, information at all. I think the best example of that was just before the Olympics when Putin was in China. Xi met with him. It was the first world leader that Xi had met with in over 2 years. And Putin lied to his face about what was about to happen in Ukraine. And his staff didn't dare challenge Putin's words. And so Xi was apparently completely flabbergasted when the war started. And the Chinese now know that everything that they thought was true about the world is wrong. The Russians aren't as tough as they were. Their weapons don't work as well. The West is willing to stand up for countries that get invaded, not just countries, companies, boycotts. That's something they never even thought was possible. The idea that a shareholder or a consumer could pressure a company to change their global position. They now know that taking Taiwan would be harder. They know that Taiwan would have more support. If the sanctions that were put on the Russians were put on the Chinese, that would destroy the country because Russia, despite all its faults, is an energy and food exporter. China's a massive importer of all of that stuff. So it de-civilized within a year. So everything that she thought was true, everything that the Chinese have been preparing for the last 40 years, they've been doing it wrong. And since Xi no longer has a group of smart people that he can put into a back room with some pizza and bourbon to come up with a plan B, all Xi can do is slam his head into the wall over and over and over until something cracks. And so we're seeing failure points across the entire Chinese system now. Even if Chairman Xi was to duct tape himself to a lawn chair and jump in the pool, I don't think this could be fixed, or at least not in the amount of time that China has left. Xi has been so successful with his purges that he's removed all potential leadership and intelligence capability within 2 generations of the Chinese system. And the next generation down, people aged 30 and under, have been gutted by the one-child policy. So it's a tiny group in relative terms. Some degree of disintegration of the Chinese state is now baked in, and that's before you consider the general breakdown of their economic model. The Chinese system is based on over-financing in order to shove capital into the coffers of every individual company so that they can employ people even if there's nothing for them to do. It gives people jobs so they don't rebel. But even that is dependent upon an export strategy that no longer works. China imports the vast majority of its energy or the inputs for its food system or the inputs for its manufacturing system, and then is dependent upon the sales of those manufacturers the world over. The only way China can play in that game is if the U.S. Navy encourages it, which we have been doing since 1980. All the United States has to do if the goal is to crush the Chinese is to go home. And even if the U.S. continues to play, the demographic situation combined with the cult of personality is more than enough to drive the system into the ground.
China didn't start to urbanize until 1980, and then they did it all at once. So people in a single generation went from living on a subsistence farm to a high-rise condo. And so they went from having 7 kids to 1 kid in 1 generation. The one-child policy was on top of that. And now that it's been more than 40 years, they don't have a lot of people aged under 40. There's no one left to have the next generation. So this was always going to be the last generation for the People's Republic. It was always going to be a 2-generation experience total. But it's happened so fast that we don't even have an economic theory developed. Humankind does not have an economic theory for what would allow the Chinese economy to function in 2030. It's that far gone. Especially when you're talking about demographics in China, we can only rely on the data we have. And with the Chinese now admitting publicly that it's all been fabricated, this fastest aging society in human history, that's the fabricated story. That's the best case scenario. The reality is significantly worse. And even if you believe the data on its face, Shanghai and Beijing already have the lowest birth rate of any metros in human history. So the pace of the disintegration here is really difficult to wrap your mind around. And I think disintegration is the word. We are looking at the end of China as a political entity within a decade or two, and as an economic entity within a decade. Wow. Whether or not the CCP survives that is an open question, because for the CCP, economic growth is no longer perceived as the path to legitimacy. So that the politics can go in a lot of weird directions. But let's talk about the country as a whole. It will not be able to hold together. It will not be able to fuel and feed itself. And in that sort of environment, the capacity of Beijing and the northern core to control all the outlying territories is absolutely going to come into question. Now, China has only existed as a unified entity for about 10% of its 3 millennia of history. It is usually fractured apart. And in situations where it has been together and then it's broken down, what usually happens is the northern zone turns into a famine-redded hellscape where there's not energy, there's not food, there's a bit of a low-grade civil war, and the central government is desperate to oppress people into unity. And it's an ugly, ugly place to live. They'll probably lose half of their population. Then the southern cities from Shanghai on south, you're right, this is where the value add is. This is where the cosmopolitan is. This is where the bulk of the higher value-added manufacturing is. And this is where foreigners are more exposed and where we might actually feel it. If northern China were to vanish tomorrow, we might not notice. Those southern cities, that's the part that's internationally wired. So historically speaking, these cities become de facto independent city-states, and they interface with foreign countries and companies in order to access technology and finance and food. And then that's metabolized by local labor to participate in an international supply chain of some form. And then everything in the interior regresses.
Xi spent his first 5 years purging the country of all of his political opponents. And then he spent his next 5 years purging the country of all theoretical opponents, which meant anyone who could think. There's nobody left. So yes, those institutions do exist to a degree, but they're either staffed by people who are utterly incompetent or patsies who got their job because of their personal loyalty. Even in Russia, which is not what we would call an information-free society, there are still a handful of people at the top that will talk to Putin and tell him uncomfortable truths. Now, 3 of them are competent. 3 of them are not.
Interesting.
So he is getting a steady stream of misinformation and propaganda, but there are 3 people who will tell him the truth. Xi has nothing like that. If you remember Deng Xiaoping, he was the second generation leader, the guy after Mao. He was probably the best leader that China has ever had because he realized what the strengths and the weaknesses of the Chinese system were, and he worked assiduously internationally to address the weaknesses and leverage the strengths. So he is the guy who met with Nixon and was brought into the American post-World War II, Cold War, international globalization structures. And that set the stage for the industrial expansion to create the China that we now know. And he wanted to make sure that they never had a repeat of Mao. So he personally selected not just his successor, but the following guy too. And that's Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. Between the 2 of them, they ruled China for 20 years. And that has been the golden age of China. But he knew that he was not smart enough to figure out who should run the country 30 years on. And so he left it to those 2 factions to come up with a compromise candidate. And the compromise candidate was Xi Jinping. Unfortunately for Jiang and Hu, Xi spent his first 5 years outmaneuvering them and gutting both factions. And then the second 5-year period, getting rid of anyone who might theoretically form a new faction. And so if you remember when he crowned himself president for life about a year ago, Hu Jintao was up on one of the desks on stage when it all went on, and they publicly escorted him out to underscore to the country just how there was no opposing power center anywhere, even theoretically in China anymore. It's just Xi.